Welcome everyone to the lecture on collaboration enabled by MIS, sometimes called collaboration technologies. We're going to talk a lot about how organizations and individuals use different technologies to work together, to collaborate with one another. Now, next class, we will actually be in the normal classroom, and we will be having our debate on whether IT matters or doesn't matter. So make sure to check out the readings for whether IT matters or doesn't matter. There's a required reading by Nick Carr, a Harvard Business School professor who wrote a very provocative article several years ago. That's what we'll be reading, a segment of that. And then we will also read some of the rebuttal letters to that article when it was first published. I want you to focus for the debate on what are the key arguments for each side. What is Nick Carr's best arguments that IT doesn't actually matter? And what are the best arguments for those who are writing rebuttals saying that IT does in fact matter, and is there anything else going on? So make sure to read those articles. Come prepared to debate. I'll take participation in class participation, and we'll talk about those issues on whether IT does or does not matter. So in this class, here's some sample exam questions, some things you should understand by the end of this lecture. So one thing, what is crowdsourcing, and why would an organization choose to invoke crowdsourcing as a method? We'll talk about crowdsourcing. Second question, what are the goals of collaboration? Why would an individual or an organization decide to collaborate? And then also we'll talk about some of the tools that are available for doing collaboration. Mostly we'll focus on the individual level. That's just kind of where my interests lie, but we'll also talk about some other things and how these differ and are similar across different technologies. So as I mentioned, we can collaborate among small groups, between two people, among individuals, in teams, but also across organizations or between organizations or among multiple organizations. One of the ways that we collaborate is through something called outsourcing. Outsourcing is a term you've probably become familiar with. Outsourcing can take a number of different forms, but essentially it is getting services from outside of the company or goods from outside of the company. Something that we don't produce that we want to bring in-house. Now, in terms of technology outsourcing, we often think about things like call centers, systems development projects, which we'll talk about later in the semester, infrastructure outsourcing, where we take our servers and have someone else run our servers at a location that's not our location. It can be a number of different types of outsourcing, and we'll talk much more about outsourcing when we'll have a case on it, and we'll talk about it when we do the management of MIS section of the course. Another type of collaboration, though, is something called joint ventures. Now, a joint venture is where two or more companies get together and decide to do something, all right? Have some joint experience to make both companies money and hopefully a very profitable one. One that students are usually fairly familiar with is Hulu. If you've ever used Hulu, Hulu is a competitor to Netflix and some of the other video streaming sites. The difference with Hulu is it was, instead of a startup company, it was actually created by multiple of the media companies. So Disney and some of the other broadcast companies got together and said, hey, we're losing a lot of money to piracy through people sharing our movies and videos and television programs on BitTorrent and other file sharing tools. Why don't we get together and find a way that we can stream legal videos online and then monetize it, do our traditional advertising model, or at least some modification of that, and see if we can make it work. So the companies got together and created Hulu, and it's been somewhat successful. So that's an example of a joint venture, and many organizations go into joint ventures, and this is an example of collaboration, and oftentimes technology is heavily involved in these collaborations. So why would an individual or an organization decide that they wanted to engage in collaboration? Well, there's a number of potential purposes. So number one, oftentimes we think collaboration will lead to better problem solving. Now, as we'll see in just a minute on some research, that isn't always the case, but we think it will be the case, that if we get different people with different perspectives in the room, that somehow we're going to come to a better decision, a better solution to our problem. So those first two might not actually be true when it comes to individual and team level collaboration, but we think that they should be true, and so oftentimes people collaborate for those reasons. Related to this, we usually consider that one person has a set of skills and ideas and capabilities and some creativeness that might be quite a bit different from what someone else brings to the table. We value diversity. And so oftentimes we hope that by bringing different individuals or even different organizations into a collaboration that we can become more innovative and creative, that we can also become more productive and hopefully profitable. We're worrying about businesses here. And sometimes we collaborate because we just don't have those skills or abilities that some other person or organization has. And so we want to grab those capabilities or complementary abilities because we just don't have them. Now, students oftentimes, especially for group projects, will think, hey, you know what? Let's collaborate on this group project. Let's work together so that we can spread the load around, all right? You do this, you do this, you do this. And as it turns out, how does it usually work when everything's just divided and then thrown back together at the end? Well, usually not very well. Professors are very good at looking at papers and projects and going, well, this part is written very differently from this part. Clearly this was by different people. And so sometimes we collaborate because we think that's a good idea, but oftentimes it isn't a great idea to collaborate in that particular way. It's much better sometimes to, for student projects, for example, spread the work around is fine, but have one or two people that are responsible for bringing it all together at the end and making the voice and making everything sound right and work together. Now, how does collaboration actually impact individuals and organizations? Well, one of the impacts of collaboration and using technology to collaborate is that we really change how work happens. Many, many years ago, before we had, basic electronic communication, email, and the like, we didn't do things the same way that we do now. A lot of our work that we do is at a computer, using technology, engaging with other people, solving problems electronically, working through, lists of things that we need to do, creating documents that are electronic. And so things are just different. The nature of work has shifted. Related to that also is organizational structures, and you may or may not have talked about this in other classes. The way that organizations organize themselves, structure themselves, have jobs and responsibilities and who reports to who, how that all works out, oftentimes changes when collaboration technologies get involved. For example, many organizations are moving much towards a flatter organizational structure rather than have a boss who has a boss who has a boss who has a boss all the way up to the CIO or CEO. Oftentimes, modern organizations are very cross-functional, all right? Meaning, if you're an accountant, you may work on a project with a marketer and with an operations person and with, an MIS person. And so these cross-functional teams and more project-based teams lead to a flatter organizational structure. We'll talk more about this sort of idea of silos and organizational structure when we get to enterprise systems. Another huge impact, though, is our work tends to be very distributed. Every semester in class, I usually ask students how many of them have ever worked on a team that they have never met one or more of the team members in person. And usually it's about 10% of the students, at least in this area. In other universities, it's sometimes a little higher. But it's very, very common for organizations to have teams from various different locations around the world. Sometimes this is beneficial because you have one section of the team that might be in a time zone that works at the nighttime of another team. And so sometimes the work and the project moves forward 24 hours a day, or at least more than 8 hours a day. So just teams work being distributed is much more common. And even when people are pretty close by each other, when you have a virtual or distributed team, sometimes you might even email or call someone whose office is 2 or 3 doors down from you, just because that's the nature of our work nowadays. And then the last impact of collaboration is that our work tends to be, not always, but tends to be more focused on innovation than it ever has before. Creativity really, really matters. Whenever MBA programs are ranked and evaluated, one of the things that they really, the evaluators, Business Week, for example, one of the things that they criticize MBA programs is that we don't know how to innovate as well. And that's something that as a business school we really try to push students to be able to do, is to be creative, to come up with new ideas. Don't just apply someone else's old idea. And with collaboration and collaboration technologies, we often can be better at being innovative. All right, so how does collaboration actually work? This figure's from a different textbook, but I kind of like the idea behind it. It's very simplistic, but I think it rings true in my experience, and I think it's illustrative of what I want to get at. So on the far right, we have performance, and ultimately, however we define performance, whether this is higher quality, whether this is more efficiency, whether it's more innovativeness or creativity, faster to market, whatever our metrics for performance, we tend to see in the research literature, when people study organizations and small teams, that when they collaborate well, when their collaboration quality is high, the middle circle there, when that's high, the performance tends to be quite a bit higher. So the question is, how do we get people to collaborate well? Because just throwing them onto a team, putting them in a room and giving them a job to do, doesn't necessarily mean that their collaboration quality is going to be high at all. In fact, it often isn't. So what is it actually made up of? Well, early on, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about Nick Carr and the Does IT Matter, or IT Doesn't Matter paper that he wrote. Early on, a lot of people said, you know what? Collaboration is good. We should do that. Let's throw a bunch of money, a bunch of tools, different technologies at collaborating. So that green box for collaboration technology is the idea that we need the technology in order to collaborate properly. And it's useful. But the problem is, if we just throw money or just throw technology at a problem, and this is a kind of a universal truth, if we just throw money or technology at a problem, it usually doesn't become solved. So what we really have to have is we have to marry together the capability to collaborate and the proper or correct collaboration technologies. And there may be one or more for various different situations or various different groups or various different individuals. But when we put those together, the capabilities to collaborate and the right collaboration technology, then the collaboration quality tends to be there, and performance is a direct result from that. So how do we evaluate these collaboration technologies? I actually do a lot of my research in this area, and there's a number of different ways we can look at the different technologies. But one of the most common ways of evaluating is along these two different dimensions, evaluating different technologies. And these are the dimensions from rich to lean, I'll define those in a second, and from asynchronous to synchronous. All right, so synchronous means at the same time. So with a synchronous collaboration technology, or a technology that allows for synchronous communication and collaboration, we're allowing the participants to both or all act at the same time. For example, if you were to talk to someone face to face, that is very synchronous, okay? Even if people take turns when someone else is talking, you're still kind of doing the communication at the same time. Whereas asynchronous means that the collaborators are not acting in the same time period. So for example, if you receive an email and then wait for a day or two or three before you send another email out, well, that communication isn't really happening at the same time. Both the sender and the receiver and vice versa aren't acting at the same time. So that tends to be a little more asynchronous. Now the other dimension, rich to lean, has to do with the cues that can be transmitted through the different communication or the collaboration technology. And what I mean by cues is how many different ways can you convey information. For example, some technologies allow you to convey text cues, okay? Email, text messaging, things like that. Other technologies allow you to convey voice, like a telephone call or a web conference or a face-to-face communication. Some technologies allow you to convey things like facial expressions and gestures, things like video conferencing. And so the more or the wider variety of different symbols that can be communicated, the richer the technology. And the fewer different symbols that can be communicated, the leaner the technology. So historically, lean, like the leanest, has usually been defined, even not terms of technology, but like a written memo is super lean, right? It's written out, it just has words on it, and it doesn't really convey anything besides that. I mean, as rich as you get, I guess, is bolding the font or something like that, okay? Whereas face-to-face communication tends to be considered the richest because you get facial expressions, you get gestures, you get the vocal tone, the pitch, the volume of the and the words that are communicated. So there's a lot of things going on face-to-face. So I want you to pause, take a minute, and let's do a top hat exercise. Okay? So I have a few questions on Top Hat where you're going to take various technologies, like email, for example, or text messaging, and I want you to click on the graph on where you would put it, okay? So there's a number of different questions, but if you think that something is rich but synchronous, then maybe you want to put it up in this upper corner right here. Whoops. Oh. And if it is asynchronous and lean, it would go down in this corner. But wherever you want it, maybe it's right in the middle, okay? Sort of sometimes asynchronous, sometimes synchronous. Go ahead and answer those questions now. Pause the video and then come back to it. All right, welcome back. This is a little heat map of where people clicked last time, last semester when I asked the exact same questions. So for email, here's how things broke out. Some people thought that email was quite rich, all right? Some people thought that email was very synchronous. Most people thought that email was in the asynchronous and lean side of things. Which is an important thing to note, is that not everyone agrees on how these different media should be evaluated on these dimensions. For some people, email is richer and more synchronous, but for most it isn't. Okay? And that's important for when you choose technologies, to choose technologies that work for everyone who's doing the collaboration. Let's look at the next one. Video conferencing. Now, video conferencing tends to be the one where there's the most agreement. It tends to be evaluated as fairly rich or quite rich and quite synchronous. Things are happening at the same time amongst the participants, and things are fairly rich. There are a lot of different cues that are being sent at the same time. So this one tends to have a lot of consistency. All right, let's talk about this next one, instant messaging. Instant messaging is kind of all over the board, okay? So with instant messaging, we're talking about the old instant messaging clients like ICQ and MSN Messenger and Yahoo Messenger, and then moving towards the more modern clients like WhatsApp and WeChat and Viber and Facebook Messenger, and there's others out there, okay? But if you notice this, that most people consider these much more synchronous, okay? Which is very interesting, okay? But it's quite a bit, there's quite a range from rich to lean on whether these technologies are on the rich side or on the lean side. There tends to be a little bit of a center mass just on the leaner side, but it's not very consistent. And so for some people, this is considered a very rich technology to use, and some it's very lean, but most people consider it to be synchronous. Similarly, let's look at a phone call. So this is a telephone call, okay, a cell phone call, but just the call portion. Most people would consider this to be quite synchronous, all right, because both people are talking at the same time, or at the very, least they're taking turns and they're sort of talking fairly close to each other. But there's quite a bit of variation in whether people think this is rich or lean. You don't get the visual cues with a phone call, but you do get the tone of voice and the volume and some of the other things. And so this one's somewhere usually in the middle. Now, an online discussion forum, this could be something like a Slack, which we'll talk about. It could be, your Blackboard groups. It could be Reddit. It could be, a whole bunch of different online discussion forums. These ones tend to be lean and asynchronous, and there's some outliers, but there's some fairly decent consistency on this. For some discussion forums, you can add pictures and videos and other, emojis and things like that, but people tend not to use synchronous communication. Now, this one is the one I find the most interesting, is text messaging. Text messaging is very, very different from individual to individual. For some people, sending them a text, you would expect a response maybe sometime in the next week. For others, if someone sends you a text and you don't respond within a couple minutes, they might call an ambulance because they think you're dead, right? Because for some people, the expectation is that this is a very synchronous form of communication. And for many people, the way that they use text messaging becomes very rich, okay? Whether that's through the use of emojis or animated images or videos, or whether it's just text, it differs quite a bit from individual to individual on whether this is considered lean or rich. And so this technology is very interesting, and you've got to be careful in using it because people think about it differently. And then the last one is a shared whiteboard. And I didn't actually get this one, capture this one last year. We will capture this one, and we'll talk about more about this one in a little bit. All right. So, which should you use? Well, the answer is often tricky. Because of copyright issues, I can't embed this in my video here, but if you search for correct tone in email on YouTube, or if you go to this link, and I'll put a link with this video, watch this 45-second video and see if you can identify if this is the correct collaboration technology to use in this situation. All right. So the question in that video is that the appropriate form of communication or collaboration technology to use in that situation? Should you email the emergency services? Well, the answer is probably no. It's probably not the right form of communication because a more synchronous form of communication might be useful, one that can allow you to impress upon the recipient the urgency of the call or the message. However, some emergency services, because some technologies like text messaging are becoming more and more common, are starting to allow alternative ways of contacting them that aren't just through calling them on the phone, 911, for example. So here's a list of a number of different technologies here. There are others out there. Which one should you tend to use? Which one is best? Well, the answer, as you might suspect, is, well, it depends. Okay, it depends on the recipient that you're sending a message to. It depends on what the norms are in your team, your group, your culture, whatever it happens to be. It depends on the task that you're trying to accomplish. And so some of these things are more appropriate than others. So let me talk a little bit about some research, including some of mine. Most of this isn't mine, though. There's some good research on something called a communication repertoire. And the idea of a communication repertoire is that there really isn't one technology, collaboration technology, that is most appropriate for a particular situation. It's actually a set of collaboration technologies to use between you and the recipient. So let me give you an example of this. Maybe with your team, sometimes you email back and forth, but sometimes you pick up the phone and call, all right? Because there's different tasks, different situations, different timing that might be better to use one over the other. Okay? And so you might switch among the different technologies. The second bullet point here has to do with bad news. There's a great study many years ago about delivering bad news. As it turns out, when you want to give bad news to someone, deliver bad news, you want to use the leanest technology that you can find. All right? You want to break up with someone over text messaging. You want to email someone that they are fired. You do not want to be doing anything with video conferencing when you're delivering bad news. However, if you're on the receiving side, you want to receive bad news with the richest form of technology that you can. You want to see the other person's or hear the other person's emotion. And so there's this real disconnect here between how people want to deliver bad news and how people want to receive bad news. The third one is the choice of our technology, whichever collaboration technology we choose to use. Instead of being based off of our evaluation of one technology versus another technology, or whether we think email is good or bad, it actually may be much more based off of how complex our mental models are around all of the various technologies. Now, this isn't going to be on the exam, but it's a very interesting thing that the complexity of how our cognitive schema, our mental models are around these choices might actually be the driving factor behind our choices. The fourth bullet point has to do with hidden information. There is a dearth of information, a ton of research studies that tells us that when people get together in a team and they're given a job of making a decision, that if the team has different information about the problem, okay, some shared information, okay, but some different information. Let's say you're trying to hire someone. Everyone maybe went to out to dinner with one of the job candidates, okay, but as you brought all of these different candidates in, some people read the resume, some people conducted the first interview, some people did, walking the person around on a tour, and you might have gotten a different perspective about different job candidates. And so when the team comes together in order to decide who they want to hire, some information is common and some information is hidden. Now, as it turns out, when you get people together in a room, they almost never bring up the hidden information. It's always a discussion of the common information, which kind of negates the importance of getting people with different perspectives in a room. Okay, and so sometimes we make bad decisions because we don't share the common information. Now, as it turns out, what happens if we use technology? Well, there's a lot of research on this that says, if we use technology, people share the hidden information and the common information, but when they go to make their decision, they ignore the hidden information. So the technology helps, but it doesn't fully help. And researchers are still working on trying to tease out how do we get people to apply this hidden information and not to discount it. And then the last bullet point, sometimes practitioners and people just think that certain technologies are terrible at doing certain tasks. For example, a lot of people say that email is terrible for sending emotional communication or humorous communication. It's just not the right technology for that. Well, as it turns out, that's not exactly the case. In some cases, email, because of its characteristics and leaner collaboration technologies, might be better at communicating certain things like social communication and emotion than even more rich and more synchronous technologies. So I have quite a bit of research on that and made the news a year or two ago quite a bit about that. Now this slide on current research will not be on the exam because I think it's a little bit beyond where we need to go in this class, but it's very interesting. There's a lot of current research going on in evaluating collaboration technologies. All right, so let's look at a couple of other tools that you may or may not have actually come across before. So this one is a online whiteboard. Now, in this case, I'm only going to have one person on this screen, but if we go and we can go and draw a picture, we could go and draw, there's a circle, and we could draw a triangle and arrows, and we could, do all sorts of different things. Multiple sizes, and we could pick out different colors. Let's go for some nice green and gold for our colors. Now, obviously my drawing capabilities are very minimal, but think to yourself, what might be the purpose of, if we were to invite people, multiple people at remote locations, being able to draw at the same time? What's the benefit of that? Think about that to yourself for a second. Well, whether you came up with an answer or not, it's very useful for certain types of problems to get people together around some shared visual document. In MIS, we will cover this a little bit when we get to databases, but we won't really go into it in great depth. But in MIS, we have a number of different drawings that we use to represent what's going on with the real world, with business requirements, and with technology to help try to translate the real world to the technical world. And we use some very standardized drawings. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. And it's exceptionally useful to have multiple people look at them and evaluate whether they're correct or not. Okay, draw pictures. When you're doing user interface design, we'll talk about that on one lecture. Does it matter to have multiple people look at the same thing at the same time? Often it's very beneficial. So these tools have minimal value in some types of tasks, but are very, very useful in other types of tasks. All right? Let's move on to another one. Next one is mind mapping. So here's a very simple mind map. This one's a free one to use. So let's consider this mind map. Mind maps are a little like outlining, but it's a nice way to visually kind of either brainstorm or to outline or to talk about certain types of structured information. So for example, here's our root node. We've got collaboration technologies. Maybe we want to go and put, rich collaboration technologies, and we could, talk about things like email. Oops. And maybe we'll do lean here. Oops, email's not rich. Let's do. And we'll do email out here. And what do we decide that for some people maybe instant messaging fit over here, but for other people maybe instant messaging was a little bit more over here. Let's remove that one. So you can see that we're slowly, this one's a little cumbersome, but it's free. We're developing this little map, and it can branch all over the place. And it's very useful for doing certain types of brainstorming and diagramming and working together as a team. And this one can also be worked with multiple different people at the same time, which is a really nice tool to use at times. That's mind mapping. All right, next one is wikis. Now, most of you are very familiar with Wikipedia, but there are other types of wikis out there and other topical wikis out there that are useful for having a document that can be edited by multiple people at the same time. So it's very common for organizations to have an internal wiki to help document internal processes and internal procedures, and that people within the organization can edit that wiki rather than having multiple documents all over the place. And so they can be very useful. Other tools that are becoming very common are things like Google Docs or Google Drive and Microsoft's OneDrive and its Office 365 and other suite. And so these collaborative document editing tools, many of you have used these before, are really quite nice for being able to edit a Word document or a spreadsheet document at the same, or PowerPoint document, by multiple individuals at the same time, and sharing and commenting and working together. And so I highly recommend for your group presentation, for example, to potentially use some of these technologies and see how they work if you haven't. So from a security perspective, though, What are the implications of using these tools? Well, one of the things is, where is the data at? And who owns the data? In most cases, some of these cloud providers like Google Drive and things, you own the data, but not all of them. And so you've got to be careful on that. Where's the data at? In some countries, especially some parts of Europe, it's illegal to store data outside of country boundaries if it's certain types of data. So you couldn't store it on, for example, Microsoft or Google or Amazon's cloud services unless they had locations in that country. And then also, are they really secure? Who else can see our communication if we're sending a instant message from one place to another? Can Facebook see our messages? Can WhatsApp see them? Can Verizon or AT&T or Sprint or T-Mobile or whoever our service providers see our text messages? Does that matter? From a security perspective, we have to be very careful. Can Google see our Google Docs and our Google Drive documents? Sure, if they wanted to. And so there's definitely some security implications of using these different tools. All right, we're going to learn a lot about Slack. Okay, so Slack is a very interesting company. They have some really stiff competition as Microsoft is ready shortly in the next couple of months to unveil their Microsoft Teams product, which is a direct Slack competitor. But Slack is a really nice form of mostly text, but other ways of collaborating amongst teams. To some extent, Slack is kind of running Silicon Valley. I mean, most startups and most organizations within the region and within the other areas, the pockets of technology startups in the country, most of them use Slack to communicate. And so you've gotten a little bit of flavor of Slack. We'll see more. They're constantly adding things. It works with a ton of different add-ins. We won't use many of the add-ins this semester, but it works with a ton of different other technology products. And then, I'm interested in your feedback. What do you like so far about Slack? What do you dislike? What do you want to know how to do, or what would you like Slack to be able to do? Is there any add-ins that you're familiar with that you want to use? Let me know on Slack. Oh, and Slack is currently valued at over $3 billion and seems to be going up. We'll see if competition changes that. All right, we've already kind of talked about inter-firm collaboration. This is multiple organizations working together on partnerships, joint ventures, and outsourcing. So we'll talk about that later as we get to outsourcing and management of MIS. But I want to talk about one very particular type of collaboration to kind of wrap things up. And that's the idea of crowdsourcing. Now, crowdsourcing, you might be familiar with this. Crowdsourcing is kind of a new concept, or at least one that is new in its popularity over the last few years. So crowdsourcing is when we take the sort of the masses of the internet, people all over the place, and we get their input. Sometimes it's work, sometimes it's ideas, sometimes it's their computing power, whatever it happens to be. We're asking people, a huge crowd of people, to source services for us. Sometimes there's financial incentive involved. Sometimes there's not. Oftentimes there's not. So here's some examples. Now, the Do Us a Flavor campaign by Lay's, the potato chip company, is actually over, but at the Internet Archive, we can kind of see what the campaign looked like. So let me pull, oops, that's not the one I want. Let's pull that up. All right, so this is the site as it used to be, so that Lay's asked people, at least in this country, to create new flavors for them, come up with new ideas for flavors. All right, and they did. So they, all sorts of, different flavors were suggested by people on the internet. So this page shows what the, for 2015, what the finalists were for different flavors. So West Coast truffle fries, Southern biscuits and gravy, New York Reuben, and cooked Greektown gyro. And these are ideas that people came up with. And Lay's then made them into a potato chip. So you can get some of these flavors like biscuits and gravy. You can go buy those in the stores because people, just normal consumers, gave their ideas for free to Lay's for the chance to win, win some money, but most people didn't win. It's just a nice way of doing market research. We'll talk much more about software and open source software, so that's another example of crowdsourcing, but I'm not going to go into it here. Another example is the Foldit, or the Folding at Home project, which is kind of interesting, where people download a program, and when your computer's not doing anything, when you're away from it but it's still on, it will go and do different calculations and contribute to some scientific projects. Another great example of crowdsourcing is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, sometimes called MTurk. With this, you can sign up with Amazon and you can do jobs that people have posted that range in the a couple of cents to a couple of buck jobs that sometimes don't take very long. Fill out a survey or do a study, and oftentimes people will do this, especially in their downtime while they're at their work that they don't have anything to do, or to make a couple of extra bucks here and there. It's a way of crowdsourcing for little money of getting people to do jobs for whatever whoever customers Amazon has been able to find that are asking for jobs. But as an example, though, here's some that are very a little more high profile. So Kickstarter is a special type of crowdfunding or sourcing campaign where people are trying to crowdsource venture capital money essentially. So again, Kickstarter is kind of the most famous of these types of companies. There are a few out there. The king of crowdfunding campaigns is a video game called Star Citizen that's raised over $75 million on various different crowdfunding platforms, including Kickstarter. And then the Pebble smartwatch, which recently announced that it was kind of going under as a company, raised more than $10 million in its initial campaign on Kickstarter, and then was in the midst of a second Kickstarter campaign when they decided to fold. So not everything works on Kickstarter. But let's go and check out Kickstarter for a little bit. So here's their website, and we can browse some of the different projects. And so maybe we look at some of the projects that at least Kickstarter has identified that they love. That one's kind of cool, a small little transparent speaker. And, they've got $126,000 raised, about 50% of their funding needed in order to produce this. Here's a adventure game. I don't know if that's a card game or a video game, but that looks pretty interesting. We go down here. There's a little mini Lego drone kit that $2,895 have been pledged, 38% of the way towards their goal. Here's a comic book Kickstarter. Let's check out. Oh, there's an interesting one. A Canadian cookbook. All right, let's check that one out. It's 80% funded. People want to make this particular book. They need $5,000 in order to get the book going. And we can look and say, hey, here's all about Canada. All right. Looks pretty interesting beyond different recipes. So that's crowdfunding. And the last example I want to give, I really like this one, is Lego. Most people are familiar with Lego. They recently surpassed Mattel a year or so ago as the largest toy company in the world. They're moving into other things like more movies and things like that. But they have a really clever crowdsourcing platform at ideas.lego.com. So let me pull up that website. Here's ideas.lego.com. So the way that works is that anyone can register, log in, and create an idea, create a set, a Lego set, and then try to get people who will like it. Lego, if enough people like it, they'll look over it, and if they like it enough and they think enough people will buy it, they'll create the product. All right? So, for example, here's one on Andy's room from Toy Story, and somebody created this little set and designed it, and so right now 1,915 people are supporting this project. Usually Lego wants about 10,000 in order to actually evaluate a project. So here's some other things. Gilmore Girls is back on. We've got, let's see, what else? A Star Wars arena, a cool lighthouse. These are all sets that people have designed. Some are simple, some are complex. Here are some that have actually received the 10,000 supporters. There's an Iron Giant, Ship in a Bottle, Ray's Speeder from Star Wars, Red Dwarf, 50s Diner, etc. And then at the bottom, we can kind of see here are some products that actually made it to the shelves. So, there's an Adventure Time set and a Beatles Yellow Submarine, and this cool maze, which is now sold out, and Doctor Who and Wall-E. And so these were sets that were created, Big Bang Theory, some various birds. But now some of these are no longer available. But because of this, Lego is allowing some of its market research and design to be crowdsourced for free, or mostly for free. The people who design the sets do get a little bit of the percentage of the sales, I believe, and I think they get a free set. And so people are motivated to create cool sets and to, Lego get some great ideas out of this. All right, so that's the end of our collaboration lesson. Next class, which will be in class in our normal classroom, we will talk about competitive advantage, how MIS does or does not provide competitive advantage. In particular, we're going to have a debate on this, and I'm going to evaluate participation. And so please come prepared. Please do the readings online and answer the questions that are on Top Hat. Those are due at the start of class. All right, thanks.